At Blenheim Palace, a great organ still fills the long library with sound. Carved into it is a promise, a voice to speak within these walls in years to come when ours are still. But the woman who paid for that organ has all but vanished from the house she saved. Her name was Lily Hammersley. She was an American widow with a fortune large enough to rescue a broken duke, and years before Consuelo Vanderbilt was ever spoken of at Blenheim, she put the roof back on it, warmed its cold rooms, and lit its halls with electric light. The world remembers the beautiful bride who came after her. It forgot the plain one who came first and paid. This is the story of the woman the palace forgot, and the price she paid to save it. If you want the real stories of the women who shaped power and history, the ones the textbooks left in the margins, subscribe to Feminine Legacies so the next one always finds you. Chapter 1. A naval daughter marries New York money. She was born in a manufacturing city on the Hudson, the daughter of a sea captain, and she would end her life as a duchess in a palace a grateful nation had built. Lillian Warren Price came into the world on the 10th of June, 1854, in Troy, New York. Troy was a hard, useful place, a city of iron foundries and shirt collars and river traffic, and the Price family belonged to its respectable middle, not to its rich. Her father was Commodore Cicero Price, an officer of the United States Navy who rose to command the East India Squadron, a serious rank that carried honor without a great fortune behind it. Her mother was Elizabeth Homer Payne. The family also kept ties to the Lake Luzerne country in the southern Adirondacks, and the local histories there still claim the future duchess as a daughter of their own. A naval officer's pay did not make an heiress. What it bought Lily was something rarer for a girl of her generation, a real education. She was sent to the Emma Willard School in Troy, one of the earliest serious academies for the schooling of women in America, a place built on the radical idea that a girl's mind was worth the training of it. She grew up literate, composed, and used to the company of men who moved in the world. She was not celebrated as a beauty. The word that followed her all her life was not lovely but capable, and in the end, capable would prove the more useful word. It is easy, looking back from the palace she would come to rule, to miss how ordinary her beginnings truly were. She was a provincial officer's daughter from an industrial river town, with good schooling and no fortune, and nothing in her early life promised what came next. A girl like her might reasonably have expected to marry a naval man or a Troy merchant, and to live a decent, unremarkable life a long way from any palace or any coronet. The distance between that likely future and the one she actually seized is the first true measure of the woman she was, and of the nerve it would take to close it. The turn in her story came through marriage. Around 1879 in Manhattan, Lily married Louis Carré Hamersley, and with that single act, she stepped from the edge of comfortable respectability into the neighborhood of one of the oldest fortunes in New York. The Hamersley money was not new money. It was old Manhattan real estate, the surest kind of wealth the city knew, built up across generations. It reached back to a dry goods and ironmongery business founded in the 1780s by the family patriarch, and it had been knit tighter by marriage into the family that helped found the Chemical Bank of New York. This was not the loud, showy wealth of the new railroad and steel men. It was quiet, deep, landed city money, the kind that had been rich so long it no longer had to prove it. Lewis himself had been raised to that fortune and educated to hold it. He had studied at Oxford in England and had come home to read law at the University of the City of New York, not to practice it, but to manage the holdings he had been born to. He was a man whose whole purpose was the estate, and the estate was vast. weigh what the marriage placed within Lily's reach. The Hamersley fortune would be valued, only a few years later, at around $7 million, a sum so large in the money of the 1870s that it belongs to a different order of life entirely. At a time when a comfortable American household ran on well under $2,000 a year, the income from such an estate could rebuild a family's whole world several times over, every single year. And here was the strange, sharp fact at the center of it. Louis had no children and no obvious heir standing close at hand. The entire weight of that ancient fortune rested on a single narrow point, and Lily had just married the man who stood at that point. She was in her middle 20s, poised, clever, and newly attached to money on a scale her father's quarterdeck had never dreamed of. The society pages of New York took note of the naval daughter who had married so remarkably well. What none of them could yet write, because none of them could yet know it, was that this marriage would last only a handful of years, and that its true consequence would not be the wedding at all. It would be the will. The will that Louis left behind would decide the shape of Lily's entire life. It was built, from its first line to its last, to give her everything except the one thing she would spend the next decade fighting to secure. Chapter 2. The will that tried to write her out. When her husband died, after only a few years of marriage, he left a will designed to give her the income and deny her the fortune. Louis Carré Hamersley died on the 3rd of May, 1883, at the age of 43, and was buried in the churchyard at Trinity. He and Lily had no children. The marriage had lasted only a few short years, and in place of a husband, he left her a puzzle wrapped in legal language, a settlement so carefully constructed that men would argue over its meaning for the next 30 years. The heart of it was a distinction most people never have to think about: the difference between owning a fortune and owning its income. Louis did not leave Lily his money. He left her the use of it, the entire income of the Hamersley estate, for as long as she lived. The capital itself, the buildings and the land that threw off that income, he directed elsewhere. On her death, the estate was to pass to the male line of his family, to his cousin's heirs, and, in the fullness of time, to a boy named Louis Gordon Hamersley. Lily was to be kept in wealth for life and forbidden from ever truly owning the source of it, and forbidden, above all, from leaving it to any child of her own body. Lawyers have a cold name for this arrangement. They call it a life estate. To the widow standing inside it, it meant something sharper. It meant she would be rich and dependent at once, handed an income most men never dreamed of, and told plainly that the fortune behind it belonged to a family that was not, in blood, entirely hers. Her guaranteed income was reported at around $150,000 a year. Set that against the world she lived in. A comfortable American family in those years lived on well under $2,000 across a whole year. Lily's yearly income alone was many times over that, and it arrived again and again, year after year, whether she did anything at all. She was, on paper, one of the richest single women in the United States, and she had reached that height not through her own family, and not through any child, but through a dead man's careful sentences. The Hamersley relatives did not accept those sentences quietly. What followed was an ugly, protracted, and ultimately futile campaign to break the will, or to bend it toward the family and away from the widow. It was the kind of fight that ruins softer people. Fortunes of that size draw lawyers the way blood draws sharks, and Lily was a young widow, not yet 30, standing alone against a family determined to prove she should not hold what her husband had freely given her. The estate itself sat under a heavy cloud of litigation for years on end, while the human beings around it went to war over who would finally own it. The litigation was so tangled, and the stakes so large, that the courts of New York would not deliver a final word on the ownership of the estate until 1913, 30 years after Lewis died, and 4 years after Lily herself was in her grave. Lily held her ground. This is the first clear sight in her whole story of the quality that would define her, a flat refusal to be moved off money that was hers. She did not dissolve into grief, and she did not let the lawyers arrange her future among themselves. She fought to secure her life interest, and she fought long. By one account, she did not gain full and settled access to her income until around 1891, nearly 8 years of legal grinding after her husband's death. 8 years. A young woman spent the better part of her 20s and early 30s in a war over a will, and she came out of it with the fortune intact and the freedom secured. What that fight left her was more valuable than the money itself. It left her hardened. She had learned, in the most exhausting way possible, exactly how quickly a family or a court could try to pull a woman's wealth out from under her, and exactly what it took to stop them. She was young, she was rich, and for the first time in her life, she answered to no husband and no father about how she lived or what she spent. Most women of her era who reached such a position reached it old, or widowed late, or hedged about with male trustees who held the real strings. Lily reached it young, and she had proven she could defend it. She had turned a widowhood into a fortune held in her own name, and a decade of lawsuits into a lasting independence few women of her age could dream of. The only question left in the world was what a woman with that much money and that much hard-won nerve would decide to buy. Chapter 3. The richest widow in New York decides. By her early 30s, she commanded an income most men never dreamed of, and she answered to no one about how she spent it. This is the still point at the centre of Lily's life, the years in the 1880s when she stood at the height of her potential with every road open in front of her. She was a wealthy widow in the richest city in America, at the exact moment when American wealth was learning to think of itself as a kind of aristocracy. New money was raising marble palaces up Fifth Avenue and hunting, restlessly, for older and grander things to attach itself to. Lily had the money. What she was missing, and what a certain kind of American woman had begun to hunger for, was rank. Her power in these years is worth naming precisely because it was unusual and because the age was built to deny it. It was not the borrowed power of a wife who influences a husband. It was not the social power of a hostess who controls a guest list. It was cold, personal, financial power. A large and reliable income that sat in her own name and moved only when she chose to move it. In an age when the law still expected a married woman's property to fold into her husband's the moment she wed, Lily's money was protected, first by the peculiar structure of Lily Hammersley's will, and later by the settlements she would insist upon before she ever married again. She had learned the single most important lesson a rich woman of the 19th century could learn. Keep the money in your own hands, and the men will have to come to you. The legal ground beneath her was shifting in her favour, though slowly and unevenly. On both sides of the Atlantic, the old doctrine of coverture, the rule that a wife had no separate legal existence apart from her husband, was finally being chipped away. Britain had passed Married Women's Property Acts in 1870 and again in 1882, letting wives hold property in their own right for the first time in centuries. New York had moved in the same direction through its own statutes across the middle decades of the century. Lily's independence was not simply a matter of personal grit, though it was that too. It rode on one of the great, quiet legal revolutions of the age, the slow, grudging recognition that a woman might be an owner, and not merely a thing that was owned. She was among the first generation of American women who could stand inside that new legal space and truly use it. The scale of what she now controlled is easy to lose in the abstract, so hold it in numbers for a moment. A fortune reckoned at around $7 million. An income near $150,000 a year, arriving whether she rose early or slept late. No husband with a claim on it. No children with a lien on her decisions. No father to consult. And no trustee she had not chosen. In the whole of the United States in the 1880s, the number of women who held that exact combination of great wealth and total freedom could have been counted on very few hands. She was not a born heiress in the way the Vanderbilts and the Astors understood the word, raised to it and hedged about with dynastic expectation. She was something stranger and freer. She was a self-possessed woman who had won her fortune through a marriage, a death, and a decade of lawsuits, and who now got to decide, entirely alone, what all of it was for. And she began, in these years, to look across the ocean. The most ambitious American women of her generation had discovered a market that the newspapers would soon learn to mock and to relish in equal measure. England was full of ancient titles attached to failing finances, noble families with names that rang like bells, and estates that were quietly falling down for want of ready cash. America was full of new fortunes attached to no titles at all. The trade almost suggested itself. A rich American woman could give an old English house the money it desperately needed, and take in return a coronet that no amount of Manhattan real estate could ever buy at home. Within a few years, the pattern would have a name and a parade of examples. Jenny Jerome, a New York beauty, had already married Lord Randolph Churchill and would give the world a son named Winston. The wave of the dollar princesses was beginning to gather. Lily was among the earliest to see it clearly and among the boldest to act on it. She was not a girl being steered toward a grand marriage by scheming parents. She was a grown woman with her own money and her own mind, calculating a trade with open eyes. Somewhere at the far end of that calculation stood a house she had never seen, one of the largest and most famous in England, and the disgraced man who owned it. He had a palace with a leaking roof and stripped and empty walls, and a reputation so ruined that no respectable Englishwoman would have him. He had, in short, exactly what she could fix and exactly the rank she wanted. All that remained was for the richest widow in New York to decide that a broken duke was worth the price, and she was very close to deciding. Chapter 4. The Duke no drawing room would receive. Across the ocean stood a man with one of the grandest houses in England, a scandal that had closed every good door to him, and almost no money at all. His name was George Charles Spencer Churchill, and he was the 8th Duke of Marlborough, master of Blenheim Palace, heir to a name that England had celebrated for nearly 200 years. He should have been one of the most sought-after men in the country. Instead, by the middle of the 1880s, he was very nearly an outcast, a duke whom polite society had quietly learned to leave off its lists. The ruin was of his own making, and it had a woman's name attached to it. In the middle of the 1870s, while he was still only a marquess and the heir to the dukedom, George had conducted a reckless affair with Edith, the Countess of Aylesford, the wife of the Earl of Aylesford. When the affair broke into the open, it did not stay a private matter for long. It swelled into one of the great scandals of the age. It dragged in the Prince of Wales himself, and it dragged in George's own younger brother, Lord Randolph Churchill. The palace intrigue that followed poisoned the Marlboroughs standing at court for years. An illegitimate son was born of the affair in 1881, and in 1883, the year he inherited the dukedom, George's marriage to his first wife, Albertha, ended in a divorce, a rare and scarring thing for a duke in that rigid and watchful age. The result was a man rich in everything but the two things he most needed: ready money and a good name. He held a title of the very first rank and a palace to match it, and yet he could not walk freely into the drawing rooms where his equals gathered. He was clever, restless, and genuinely curious about the modern world. He filled his time with science, with chemistry and electricity, fitting Blenheim with the newest technologies and turning corners of the ancient house into something closer to a workshop than a state apartment. He cared, by some accounts, more for his experiments than for the ordinary duties of his rank. But brilliance did not pay bills, and the bills at Blenheim were enormous, for Blenheim itself was dying by inches. It was a vast Baroque monument, a gift from a grateful nation to the first Duke of Marlborough for his victories in a war long before, and it had grown, over the generations, into a stone millstone around the necks of his descendants. The great agricultural depression of the 1870s and 1880s had gutted the rents that were supposed to keep such houses standing. The roof leaked, the rooms were cold, and the 8th Duke had already done the unthinkable to raise cash. Freed by a special Act of Parliament, the Blenheim Settled Estates Act of 1880, which allowed him to break up treasures that were meant by law never to be sold, he had begun to strip his own house of its glory. The scale of that sell-off is staggering to lay out. The famous Sunderland Library, one of the great private book collections in all of Europe, was broken up and sold. The Marlborough gems, a legendary collection of engraved stones gathered patiently across generations, went under the auctioneer's hammer. The old masters came down from the walls, one by one. Raphael's Ansidei Madonna was sold to the National Gallery in London in 1885. A great Van Dyck portrait of King Charles I went from the walls in the same tide of selling. Painting by painting, book by book, gem by gem, the 8th Duke was auctioning off the accumulated splendour of his entire line simply to keep the house standing a few years longer. The Duke himself was a study in wasted brilliance, and the field of his obsession was the future. He had wired parts of the ancient palace for electricity when most great houses still moved by candlelight, and he tinkered with chemistry and machinery in rooms his ancestors had built for banquets and for balls. Yet all his cleverness could not conjure the one thing the estate actually needed, which was cash, and cash in quantities no experiment could ever produce. The agricultural depression had hollowed out the rents beneath him, and the vast house devoured money far faster than a broken rent roll could supply it. He had sold the paintings, and the books, and the gems, and still the rain came through the roof, and still the great rooms stayed cold. He was a man of the coming century trapped inside a crumbling monument to the last one, and he was rapidly running out of things left to sell. So picture the palace that waited at the far end of Lily's calculation. From the outside, it was still one of the most magnificent houses in England, its towers and its long lake and its triumphal arch announcing a greatness that had once been entirely real. Step inside, and the truth turned colder. Bare places on the walls where a Raphael and a Van Dyck had hung within living memory. Shelves emptied of their finest books. Great rooms that no fire could properly warm, under a roof that let the Oxfordshire rain seep down into the fabric of the state apartments. The 8th Duke had sold the treasures and still could not stop the decay. What Blenheim needed now was not another auction. It needed a transfusion of new money, on a scale no English rent roll could any longer provide. It needed, though its proud master would have hated to hear it put so bluntly, an American heiress. And an American heiress, with $7 million behind her and a coronet firmly on her mind, was already looking his way across the water. Chapter 5. She bought a coronet and paid in cash. In the summer of 1888, In a plain civil ceremony at a New York City hall, an American widow made herself a duchess. On the 29th of June, 1888, Lily Hammersley and George Charles Spencer Churchill, the 8th Duke of Marlborough, were married in New York. The ceremony was performed by the mayor of New York himself, Abram Hewitt, in a civil service, and it was followed the same day by a religious one. There was no cathedral, no grand procession, no beaming blessing from a delighted family. There was a mayor, a license, and two people completing a transaction that both of them understood perfectly well. The press, on both sides of the Atlantic, understood it too, and it was merciless about it. To the American newspapers, Lily was a social climber of the crudest kind, a woman spending her dead husband's money on a rank that America was supposed to have abolished. To the English papers, she was worse still, a vulgar, rich American purchasing a husband no respectable Englishwoman would touch, a divorced man barred from his own sovereign's court. She was described again and again as plain, as no longer young, as a woman whose only real asset was her checkbook. One cruel line that made the rounds held that she had money enough to gild the Marlborough arms and precious little else to recommend her. Her looks, her age, and her motives were held up in cold print for the entertainment of two nations at once. A modern reader recognizes the machinery instantly, a press that had discovered how well a rich woman's private choices could sell. There was a private cost, too, sharper than any headline. Lily married the 8th Duke against the express wishes of her own family. They did not want the match. A divorced English duke, with a scandal trailing behind him, was not their idea of a fitting second husband for a price of Troy. And Lily married him anyway, accepting a lasting estrangement from her own relatives as part of the price of the coronet. The independence that had let her keep her fortune now cost her the people she had grown up among. She walked into her grand new life more alone than the newspapers ever guessed, having weighed the loss of her family against the gain of a title, and chosen the title with open eyes. The mockery was not really about Lily at all, though she bore the full brunt of it. It was about a new and unsettling thing the age had only just discovered: the marriage of raw American money to old English rank, and the discomfort it stirred on both shores of the ocean. Already a New York beauty named Jenny Jerome had married Lord Randolph Churchill, the 8th Duke's own younger brother, and given that union a son. Soon, a whole parade of American heiresses would follow the very same path across the water, trading fresh fortunes for ancient coronets, until at last the newspapers coined a name for them all: the dollar princesses. Lily was among the very first of that parade, and the first of anything is always the one the world laughs at hardest. She simply happened to be walking through a door before the world had quite decided that the door was respectable. Now strip away the mockery and look hard at the trade itself, because it was a clear one, and Lily negotiated it as coolly as any man of business ever negotiated a contract. She wanted rank. He wanted money. She had a fortune reckoned at around $7 million and an income near $150,000 a year. He had one of the largest and most famous houses in all of England, and a title that reached back nearly 2 centuries into the nation's memory. Each of them possessed exactly what the other lacked, and each of them knew the exchange rate to the penny. The newspapers wrote as though Lily were the desperate party, flinging her money at a reluctant aristocrat who condescended to accept her. The truth ran closer to the reverse. It was the Duke who was drowning in a cold and leaking palace. It was the widow who held the only rope. She also made certain of her ground before she ever stepped onto it. Every account of Lily's marriages agrees on the same striking fact. She kept control of her own money. She did not simply pour her fortune into her new husband's hands to spend as he liked. The wealth stayed hers, protected by settlement, drawn upon at her own discretion. She had learned in the long Hamersley War exactly how quickly a woman's money could be pulled out from under her, and she did not intend to learn that lesson twice in one lifetime. The Duchess who arrived at Blenheim in 1888 came not as a purse to be emptied, but as a proprietor who had bought a very large, very cold, very beautiful project, and fully meant to run it herself. For that is what Blenheim was to her in the end. It was a project. She had not married a man the world envied, and she surely had no illusions on that score. She had married a house the world admired, and a rank the world could not deny her. And she had married a clever, difficult, discredited man who came attached to both. What the mocking papers could not see, because they were too busy laughing at the plain American and her checkbook, was how shrewd a bargain she had actually struck. She had turned a dead New Yorker's real estate into a coronet that would sit on her head for the rest of her life. And she was about to turn it into something far more lasting than a title. She was about to spend it on stone and iron and sound, in ways that would outlast every joke ever printed at her expense. The laughter would fade within a single season. The roof she was about to pay for would keep the rain out for a century. Chapter 6. Her fortune puts a roof on a palace. She arrived at a palace that was leaking, unheated, and stripped of its greatest paintings, and she began, room by room, to put it right. This is where Lily's power stops being a matter of bank statements and becomes a matter of stone. Money on paper is an abstraction, a number in a ledger no one can stand inside. Money spent on a roof is a thing you can shelter beneath in the rain and stay dry. And what Lily did at Blenheim, across the 4 years she was its duchess, was to take an income that had bought her nothing but cruel headlines and turn it into repairs a visitor can still walk through today. The needs were basic and urgent. The needs of a house that had been starved of proper maintenance for a whole generation. The roof, above all. A palace the size of Blenheim carries acres of roof, and when that roof fails, the water comes down through the great staterooms and rots everything beneath it, plaster and timber and paint alike. Lily paid to make it sound again. The rooms were cold, warmed by nothing better than open fires in spaces built on a scale that mocked the very idea of heating them. She paid for that too. Neglected structures around the estate, the chapel, the boathouse on the edge of the Great Lake, had been left to decay while the family sold paintings to survive. She paid to restore them. Piece by piece, room by room, she reversed the long retreat of the house, and she funded every yard of it out of a fortune made in Manhattan real estate. Here is the mechanism of her power, laid entirely bare. When the 7th Duke had faced Blenheim's decline, he had watched it happen. When the 8th Duke had faced it, he had sold the family's treasures to slow it down. When Lily faced it, she simply paid to stop it. That was the difference her money made, and it was an absolute difference in kind. The men of the family had been trapped inside a failing system, land rich and cash poor, forced to auction their own inheritance just to keep the lights burning. Lily stood entirely outside that trap. Her wealth did not depend on Oxfordshire rents, or on English harvests, or on the health of a landed estate at all. It came from American cities, and it arrived every year like clockwork, and she could aim it wherever she chose to aim it. She chose to aim it directly at the failing fabric of a national monument. The 8th Duke's own great passion gave her spending a modern and gleaming edge. He was fascinated by science, and above all, by the newest of the new technologies, electricity, and under his eye, Blenheim became one of the grand houses of England to be fitted with electric light. Where generations of Marlboroughs had moved through those enormous rooms by candle and by oil lamp, the halls now glowed with a steadier, braver, more modern light, paid for by an American fortune and driven by an English duke's obsession with the future. It was a marriage of her money and his mind, and it left the ancient palace, for the very first time, genuinely modern. The rain was kept out, the cold was pushed back, and the darkness itself was lit. Watch how completely her arrival reversed the very direction of the house. For a whole generation, everything at Blenheim had moved outward and away. The books to the auction rooms, the gems to the collectors, the Raphael to the National Gallery, the Van Dyck to the nation. A slow, steady hemorrhage of treasure sold off to buy a little more time. With Lily, for the first time in living memory, the movement ran the other way entirely. Money came in, and it stayed in, poured into the fabric of the house where no auctioneer could ever reach it again. A roof cannot be sold twice. Heat and light cannot be carried off to a sale room in the morning. She spent her fortune, quite deliberately, on the kinds of things that could never be undone, that would still be there long after any painting might have been sold a second and a third time. She was not merely spending money on a house. She was locking it, permanently, into the stone. Set the numbers of the rescue against the numbers of the ruin, and the shape of what she did comes clear at once. On one side stood a house whose master had sold a great library, a gem collection generations in the making, a Raphael from its walls, and a Van Dyck of a martyred king, all of it auctioned off simply to raise cash. On the other side stood a single woman with an income near $150,000 a year, arriving with a fortune of around $7 million behind her, and spending it on the one thing all those desperate auctions could never buy back, the soundness of the house itself. He had turned Blenheim's beauty into money in order to survive. She turned her money into Blenheim's survival. It was the same house, saved twice over, by two exactly opposite means. None of this was the work of a pawn, and none of it was the passive giving the world expected of a wife. Every step of it was the work of a woman making decisions, a proprietor surveying a great damaged asset and spending, with judgment, to restore it to worth. She was not decorating a home to please a husband. She was rescuing a monument, and she knew it, and she meant her rescue to be seen. The plain American the newspapers had laughed at was quietly doing what none of the celebrated Marlborough men had managed to do. She was stopping the rot, and she was not yet finished. Having secured the roof and warmed the rooms and lit the halls, she turned to something grander than mere repair, something that would carry a voice and a promise into a future she would never live to see. She turned to the long library, and she decided to fill it with sound. Chapter 7. A voice built to speak when hers was gone. In the long library she gave the palace an instrument so grand it could shake the floor, and had words carved on it that would outlive them both. The long library at Blenheim is one of the great rooms of the house, a long corridor of a room under a high white ceiling. For most of its long life, it had been a place of books and echoing footsteps and little else. Lily's money gave it a voice. She and the 8th Duke commissioned a great organ from Henry Willis, the most celebrated organ builder in Britain. The organ ordered for Blenheim in 1888 was a giant of 4 keyboards, an instrument on a cathedral scale, set down improbably in a private library. It was, and it remains, one of the finest organs in any house in the entire country. When it sounded, it filled that vast room and pressed itself against the walls, a great wave of noise in a space that had been built for silence and the turning of pages. To install such a thing was not a repair, and it was not a necessity. It was a statement, deliberate and unmistakable. It said that Blenheim was not merely being kept alive, but being given something magnificent and wholly new. It said the house had a patron again, a real one, and that the patron had taste and nerve and money enough to indulge all three at once. The seventh Duke had let the great house fade. The eighth had sold its glories one by one. And now, in the long library, a new glory was being built from nothing, and it was being built entirely on American money. But the organ's true weight in this story is not its size or even its splendor. It is the line carved upon it. The words placed on the instrument declared that, in memory of happy days, and as a tribute to this glorious home, they had given it a voice to speak within these walls in years to come when ours are still. Read that promise slowly, because it is the heart of everything that follows. A voice to speak within these walls in years to come when ours are still. It was written as a tender thing, the private hope of a patron that the music would go on sounding long after the people who commissioned it had fallen silent in death. It was meant as a small defiance of mortality, a way of leaving something behind that would keep speaking. The words came true, in a way no one carving them could possibly have meant. The organ has spoken within those walls for more than a century, exactly as the inscription promised it would. Its makers are long since still. And the crueler half of the promise came true as well, for the voice went on speaking while the name of the very woman who paid for it fell quiet and was lost. The inscription was meant to be about music outliving mortality. It became, without anyone at all intending it, a prophecy about erasure. Her gift kept its voice down all the years. She lost hers entirely. At this moment, though, in the closing years of the 1880s, none of that long shadow had fallen yet. This was the peak, the still bright summit of Lily's whole arc. Think of what she was, in those years, in the plainest possible terms. An American naval officer's daughter who now held one of the oldest titles in England. A twice-made outsider, mocked in New York and snubbed in London, who had nonetheless become the mistress of Blenheim Palace and the single person keeping the whole enormous thing from falling down. She had mended the roof that dukes had let leak. She had warmed rooms that dukes had let freeze. She had lit halls that had known nothing but candlelight for 2 centuries. And she had filled the greatest room in the house with an instrument fit for a cathedral. No American woman of her time had reached in and reshaped an English national monument so directly or so permanently, and she had done all of it with money she had won and kept entirely in her own name. Hold that image steady, because it is not going to last. In these years, Lily Hammersley stood at the exact height of her power, a woman who had turned a dead man's real estate into the salvation of a palace and the splendor of its greatest room. She had everything the trade had promised her, the rank, the house, the deep mark upon it that would outlast her by generations. What she did not have, what no amount of money in the world could ever buy her, was time. The clever, restless, difficult man she had married had only 4 years left to live. And when he died, suddenly and without any warning, Lily would find herself standing inside a palace full of her own spent fortune, holding a title that no longer meant a marriage, and facing the first hard truth buried in her bargain. She had paid to save a house that would never, under the cold letter of the law, be hers to keep. Chapter 8. The Duke dies, and the money stays. 4 years into the marriage, the Duke was found dead, and the widow was left inside a palace full of her own spent fortune. On the 9th of November, 1892, George Charles Spencer Churchill, the 8th Duke of Marlborough, died suddenly at Blenheim. He was 48 years old. The marriage that had rescued the house had lasted barely 4 years, and it ended without warning in the very rooms that his American wife's money had warmed and lit. The manner of his death gathered stories around it, as the sudden deaths of famous men always do. The contemporary reports gave the cause as heart failure, the swift and simple stopping of a heart in a restless, hard-living man not yet 50. But another account clung to the story and would not let go of it, a stranger and far more intimate one. By that telling, the scientifically minded Duke died after inhaling chloroform, used in an attempt to relieve one of his wife's severe headaches. Whether that domestic detail is exactly true, or merely the kind of tale that fastens itself onto a chemist duke who kept a laboratory inside his own palace, it belongs in the story only as the single unconfirmed account that it is. What is entirely certain is the hard fact beneath the stories. He went suddenly at Blenheim, and Lily was a widow for the second time before she had turned 40. And now the bargain showed its cold underside. Lily had married a house every bit as much as she had married a man, and the man was gone while the house remained standing. She was a duchess still, by courtesy and by title, but the palace itself was not hers, and it never had been. Blenheim passed, as it was always going to pass, to the 8th Duke's son and heir, a young man named Charles, who now became the 9th Duke of Marlborough. Every single improvement Lily had paid for, the sound roof, the warm rooms, the electric light, the great organ standing in the long library, now belonged, along with the house that held them all, to her stepson. She had spent a fortune on a building she could not own and could not inherit, and the moment her husband's heart stopped beating, the law handed the whole of it to a young man who had contributed nothing whatever to its rescue. Weigh what she had put in against what she was now left holding. She had arrived with a fortune of around $7 million behind her and an income near $150,000 a year. She had spent freely and visibly on the very fabric of Blenheim across 4 full years, on repairs and improvements of the kind that a great house swallows in the hundreds of thousands. And now, widowed before the age of 40, she held a dowager's empty title, a life still cushioned by her own untouched capital, and not one single brick of the palace she had saved. The money she had spent on the house was simply gone into its stones, a gift she had never once been able to make conditional while her husband lived to spend it. The young man who inherited all of it was barely into his 20s, and he had done nothing whatever to earn the transformed house that fell into his hands. Charles, the 9th Duke, received a Blenheim that was warm where it had lately been cold, dry where it had leaked, and bright where it had been dark, and every single one of those improvements had been bought with the money of a stepmother he had no particular reason to love. Lily, for her part, kept only what the settlements had secured for her, her own untouched American capital and the hollow courtesy of a dowager's title. The house she had rescued now answered entirely to a boy. The great organ she had commissioned now sang for a family that was not, in law or in blood, under any obligation to remember who had paid for it. She had bought the very survival of Blenheim, and the deed to that survival belonged to somebody else. A lesser woman, or simply a more conventional one, might have accepted all of this as the natural and settled order of things. Widows gave freely to their husbands' houses. Heirs inherited what their fathers left. That was how the whole aristocratic world turned. And an American who had bought her way into that world might have been expected to swallow its rules right along with its rank and its coronet. But Lily had never once been conventional about money. She had fought the Hamersley family through the courts of New York for the better part of a decade in order to keep what was rightfully hers. She did not now intend to treat the fortune she had sunk into Blenheim as a gift she was too well bred ever to mention again. In her mind, it seems, the restoration of the palace had been an investment, and investments, by their nature, are meant to be recovered. The thought that would have scandalized every dowager in England was already taking shape in the widow's mind. She had paid for the house. Perhaps the house, or its new young master, owed her the money back. But before she could press that hard claim, the ground shifted beneath her in a way she could never have foreseen. Blenheim was about to receive another American bride, one younger than Lily, richer than Lily, and destined to be far more famous than Lily would ever be. And with that dazzling new duchess would come a new version of the whole story, one in which the plain older widow who had come first began very quietly to disappear from the telling of it altogether. Chapter 9. A new American duchess takes the story. 3 years after she was widowed, a younger, richer, far more famous American bride arrived at Blenheim, and history quietly changed hands. In 1895, the young 9th Duke of Marlborough, Lily's stepson Charles, married Consuelo Vanderbilt. That match would become one of the most famous transatlantic marriages of the entire age, and it would reshape, for more than a century afterward, the story of how Blenheim Palace came to be saved. Consuelo was everything the newspapers had wanted an American duchess to be, and everything those same newspapers had loudly denied that Lily was. She was young and famous and immensely rich, the very image of the glamorous New World heiress. And she was rich on a scale that made even the great Hamersley fortune look modest, for the Vanderbilts were among the wealthiest families in all of America, and the dowry that travelled with her ran into the millions. Her marriage to the 9th Duke was famously loveless, and its very unhappiness became part of its fame and its legend. But its money was entirely real, and it poured into Blenheim, completing and then surpassing the rescue that Lily's fortune had quietly begun 7 years before. Here is the quiet injustice at the very centre of this film, and it is worth seeing plainly and without flinching. 2 American fortunes saved Blenheim Palace. Lily's came first. Her money stopped the rot, mended the roof, warmed the freezing rooms, lit the dark halls, and filled the long library with its great organ in the years around 1890. Consuelo's fortune came second in 1895, and finished the work on an even grander scale. Both women were genuinely essential to the survival of the house. But history, when it was offered a straight choice between the two of them, kept the beautiful young bride trapped in a wretched marriage and forgot the plain older widow who had come first and paid first. The story of Blenheim's American salvation attached itself almost entirely to Consuelo Vanderbilt. Lily slid, year by year, into the margins of her own achievement. It would happen a second time with a third American woman in the very next generation. The 9th Duke's marriage to Consuelo would eventually collapse and end, and he would marry again, another American, the beautiful and brilliant and ultimately tragic Gladys Deacon, whose slow, eccentric decline into a recluse behind the locked doors of Blenheim became a dark legend in its own right. So the memory of Blenheim came to hold 2 American women fast: Consuelo, the reluctant bride, and Gladys, the doomed beauty, one remembered for her unhappy grandeur, and the other for her strange ruin. Between the two of them, they filled all the space the story had ever kept for an American of Blenheim. There was no room left in the popular memory for a capable older widow who had simply paid the bills and mended the roof and asked for no drama in return. Lily became the American of Blenheim, whom almost nobody could name. Look closely at what the Vanderbilt marriage brought with it. Consuelo came not only with her youth and her fame, but with a dowry drawn from one of the largest fortunes the modern world had ever produced, wealth on a scale that dwarfed the older money of New York. That vast fortune finished what Lily's had quietly started, and it did so with a splendor and a fame that all but guaranteed the world would watch. And because the whole world was busy watching Consuelo, it stopped watching Lily altogether. The brighter light did not merely outshine the older one. It erased it from view entirely, the way a rising sun erases the stars that had been there in the sky all along. The erasure was not a plot, and that is the strangest part of it. No one ever sat down deliberately to write Lily out of the record. It was something quieter and more ordinary, and in its own way far more cruel for being neither. History remembers drama. It remembers beauty. It remembers tragedy and scandal and doomed romance. It remembers the young bride trapped in a loveless marriage and the strange beauty who ended her days behind locked doors in a decaying palace. It does not, on its own, remember the sensible arithmetic of a roof repaired and an income spent with care. Lily's whole contribution had exactly the qualities that human memory quietly discards: competence and money, and a complete absence of scandal in the giving of it. She had done the unglamorous, essential thing, and the unglamorous, essential thing is precisely what gets forgotten. But Lily herself was still very much alive through all these years, and she was nobody's idea of a meek and fading dowager. If the wider world was quietly reassigning the credit for saving Blenheim to a younger, prettier face, Lily was about to remind everyone, in the bluntest possible language the law allowed, that she had paid for a very great deal of that house with her own money. She was not going to let the debt be politely forgotten along with her name. She was going to do the one thing that no Dowager Duchess in England was ever supposed to do. She was going to send the new Duke a bill, and when he declined to pay it, she was going to take him to court. Chapter 10. She takes the new Duke to court. She had spent a fortune on a house that now belonged to her stepson, and she decided that she wanted her money back. It is one of the most remarkable acts in Lily's whole remarkable life, and it is the single clearest proof of how she truly understood her marriage all along. Around the turn of the century, Lily pursued a legal claim against the 9th Duke of Marlborough, her own stepson, to recover the money she had spent restoring Blenheim Palace. A dowager duchess was suing the reigning duke of one of England's greatest houses for the return of her investment in it. Nothing in her entire life captures the woman she was more completely than that single fact. Think about the nerve that took, and the cold clarity of mind behind it. To the whole aristocratic world, a widow's spending on her late husband's house was an act of love and duty, a gift folded quietly into the marriage, never again to be mentioned in the vulgar and grasping language of money. Lily rejected that entire understanding of what she had done. To her, it appears, the restoration of Blenheim had been an outlay, a very large sum of her own money sunk into an asset that had then passed cleanly to someone else, and an outlay, by its nature, could be reclaimed. She did not treat her years as Duchess as a romance to be remembered fondly and paid for in dignified silence. She treated them, at least in significant part, as a transaction, and transactions have terms, and terms are meant to be honoured. She pressed the claim, by the accounts, through her third husband, Lord William Beresford, filing the action around the year 1900. The precise details of what she demanded, and of what she finally received, were kept private between the parties, and the whole matter was settled out of court on terms that were never made public to anyone. So the exact sum is lost to us now, and the precise legal argument is lost along with it. What survives, and what truly matters, is the sheer astonishing fact of the thing itself. A woman went to law against a duke to recover the money she had spent saving his house. In an age that expected its women to give quietly and to ask for nothing in return, Lily Hammersley sent a duke a bill and then enforced it. Set this beside the other women in the very same story, and its strangeness sharpens into something almost startling. Consuelo Vanderbilt, pressed into her marriage against her will and miserable within it, is remembered, rightly, as a woman to whom things were done. She was pressed into a loveless grandeur she had never chosen, and trapped inside it against her own will. That is a true story, and a genuinely sad one. But it is, at its core, the story of a pawn moved across a board by other hands. Lily's story, unfolding inside the exact same house, is the opposite. It is the story of a player. She had chosen her own marriage against her family's firm wishes. She had kept her money in her own name through every one of her marriages. She had spent that money by her own decision, on repairs of her own choosing. And when the man died and the house passed on to another, she went to court to recover what she believed she was owed. No one ever moved Lily Hammersley around a board. She moved herself, deliberately, and she sent out the bills when the moving was done. Sit for a moment with how far outside the rules this act truly was. A dowager duchess occupied a position hedged about with unwritten laws, and near the very top of that list stood one simple commandment, that she did not embarrass the house. She was meant to retire gracefully, to keep her dignity and her silence, and to let the new generation take up its inheritance in peace. Lily broke that rule without any apparent hesitation. She valued the return of her money above the comfort of the family that had absorbed it, and she was entirely willing to be talked about in order to get it back. In a world that used a woman's respectability as a leash, she calmly slipped the leash and walked. She had decided, coolly, that being paid mattered more to her than being thought proper, and she acted on that decision through the courts. The lawsuit rarely appears at all in the grand and glowing histories of Blenheim, and it is not difficult to see why it is left out. It does not flatter anyone involved. It shows a great ducal house being taken to court by its own dowager, the golden romance of the American rescue, soured into a hard dispute over pounds and shillings. It is precisely the kind of awkward episode that a proud family's official memory prefers to quietly lose. But for the work of actually understanding Lily Hammersley, it is the single most revealing act she ever performed in her life. It tells us, plainly, that she never for one moment mistook her marriage for a fairy tale. She knew exactly what she had spent, and on what, and for whom, and she fully expected to be dealt with honestly about all of it, duke or no duke, coronet or no coronet. By the time that suit was quietly settled, Lily had already remade her whole life once again, in a direction that surprised everyone who had comfortably filed her away as a fading and forgotten duchess. She had married for a third time, and she had done it, once again, entirely on her own financial terms. The man she chose was the very opposite of the cold, clever, discredited duke she had buried at Blenheim. He was warm and reckless, and adored by everyone who knew him, and utterly hopeless with money. And Lily, who had learned every hard lesson the hardest way, would hand him her whole heart and keep her checkbook firmly and forever in her own steady hand. Chapter 11. She funds a war hero and keeps the purse. In her 40s, she married again, this time a penniless soldier famous across an empire for his courage, and this time she wrote every financial rule herself. His name was Lord William Beresford, and he was as different from the 8th Duke of Marlborough as one man could possibly be from another. Where the Duke had been a disgraced intellectual with a laboratory and a ruined reputation, Beresford was a hero, one of the great daredevil soldiers of the entire late Victorian army. He was a younger son of the Marquis of Waterford, an Irish aristocrat by blood and lineage, and he had won the highest award for valour that the British Army could bestow on any man. His courage was not a story that grew in the telling. It was a matter of hard official record. Beresford had won the Victoria Cross in 1879 during the Zulu War in southern Africa, for exactly the kind of reckless bravery under fire that made a soldier a living legend among his comrades in arms. He had gone on from there to serve for years in India as the military secretary to the Viceroy, a glittering post at the very summit of the whole British Empire, moving through the Durbars and the hill stations of the Raj at the right hand of imperial power itself. He was charming and hugely popular, and brave nearly to the point of foolishness, and beloved by very nearly everyone who ever crossed his path. He had, in short, everything a man could want except for money, and any head at all for the keeping of it. One plain description of him put the whole matter with brutal economy. He had no money, and no head for money. For most heiresses in the world, that would have been a flashing warning to stay well away. For Lily, at this particular stage of her long and hard-schooled life, it was almost a reassurance. She was in her early 40s now, a woman who had buried 2 husbands and fought a family and a duke through the courts to keep firm control of her own fortune. She did not need a man to manage her money for her. She had proven, across more than 20 years, that she could manage it better than any man in her life ever had. What she wanted now, it seems, was something that the cold and calculated bargain of Blenheim had never once given her. She wanted a marriage with real warmth inside it. And so she married the penniless hero on the 30th of April, 1895, at St. George's Church in Hanover Square in London. And she arranged the finances of the whole thing exactly as it pleased her to arrange them. The arrangement was pure Lily, from first line to last. She settled a generous allowance upon her charming, hopeless husband, and she kept the full control of the money firmly in her own 2 hands. He would be provided for, and provided for well, but he would never be handed the fortune itself to lose at the racecourse or the card table. It was the very same principle that had protected her since the day the Hamersley will was read, now applied with the ease and confidence of long practice. She loved him, by every account that survives, and she funded him. And she did not for a single moment confuse the one thing with the other. A woman who had watched an entire family try to strip her of her inheritance did not now hand a man with no head for money the keys to her treasury, however deeply and truly she adored him. His years in India had made him a figure of real glamour, a man who had ridden near the summit of the Raj and won his cross in a famous and bloody war. And yet he came to Lily with empty pockets and a cheerful helplessness about ever filling them. That combination would have frightened off a lesser fortune or a more anxious woman. To Lily, at this point in her life, it was almost restful. She had married a cold genius once, and he had left her a palace she could not keep and a lawsuit she had to fight. Now she married a warm hero, and he would leave her, in the end, only a son and a grave, and he asked nothing of her fortune but that it keep him comfortable to the last. She could manage that easily, and she did. And she never once pretended the money flowed in any direction but the one she herself had chosen. And then, at an age when the whole world assumed her story was one of marriages and money and lawsuits and nothing more, Lily became a mother. On the 4th of February, 1897, in her early 40s, she gave birth to her only child, a son, and named him William Warren de la Poer Beresford. After 2 entirely childless marriages, and a lifetime defined and measured by other people's fortunes and other people's houses, she had a child of her very own at last. It is one of the few moments in her whole story that belongs entirely to her private happiness and to no one else, and it came late, and it came hard-won, deep in the 4th decade of her eventful life. There was a second, quieter reinvention running alongside the marriage, less remarked upon, but every bit as telling of the woman she had become. Lily had taken a country estate at Deepdean, near Dorking in the county of Surrey, And there she became something that no one who had ever read the sneering wedding coverage of 1888 could possibly have predicted. She became a serious, working countrywoman. She ran a genuine agricultural enterprise on her own land. She kept a herd of cattle and a real, productive dairy. She cultivated orchids in her glass houses, and she built solid cottages for her tenants. By one account, her dairy produced something on the order of 650 quarts of milk and as much as 75 pounds of butter in a single working week, along with some 16,000 eggs across the turning of a year. The plain American bride, whom the papers had once mocked as good for nothing but her checkbook, was, 20 years on, running her own land as a proper and profitable business. She had been a widow, a duchess, a plaintiff, and now she was a farmer and a mother. And she was still, in every single part of it, entirely and unmistakably her own woman. Chapter 12. The county that finally loved her. The woman the newspapers once mocked spent her last years as one of the best-liked figures in her quiet corner of England. The final act of Lily's life carried a slow, unexpected vindication that not a single headline of 1888 would ever have predicted for her. The vulgar American, the plain checkbook duchess, the grasping social climber of 1,000 cruel columns, ended her days genuinely loved in the English county she had made her home, and remembered there with a warm affection she had never once been shown in the glittering drawing rooms of New York or of London. The peace of it was hard won, and it was shadowed by one more heavy loss. Lord William Beresford, the brave and hopeless soldier she had married for love and not for advantage, did not live long enough to enjoy the settled life she had built for the two of them. He died at the very end of 1900, of peritonitis, at the age of 53. Lily was a widow now for the third time in her life. She had buried a New York real estate heir, an English duke, and an Irish war hero, and she had outlived every one of the three men through whom the world had always insisted on defining her and her worth. She was in her middle 40s, the mother of a small and fatherless son, and once again, as she had been so many times before, essentially alone with her fortune and her own hard resolve. She did not marry a fourth time. She had married first for money and for rank, and then at last for warmth, and she had buried all of it. What she did instead was simply live, quietly and well, in the green country she had adopted as her own. She kept her home in Surrey, and she spent time at Hove on the south coast. She raised her boy, and she held firmly onto her ties to the wider Churchill family, into which her second marriage had once carried her, remaining on genuinely warm terms with the young Winston Churchill, the nephew of her second husband, a young man who would go on in time to a fame that would eclipse every single Duke of Marlborough who had ever lived at Blenheim. The dowager who had been so quietly written out of Blenheim's own story remained, right to the end of her days, a valued and welcome member of its extended family. Lily died at Dorking, in the county of Surrey, on the 11th of January, in the year 1909. She was 54 years old. She had been born the daughter of a naval officer in a hard manufacturing town on the banks of the Hudson River, and she died a dowager duchess in the green and settled heart of southern England, having crossed a greater distance in one single lifetime than almost any American woman of her whole generation ever managed. The Times of London, in marking her death, wrote that she had won for herself a secure place in the affections of the British people. It was a warm and a generous line, and it was entirely true. And it is a line worth holding on to tightly, because it is very nearly the last time that the wider world would ever speak her name aloud with such clear and open regard. The place that had come to love her best showed that love in the plainest way it knew how. The town of Dorking, where she had lived, and farmed and been kind to her neighbours, named a street in her honour, and placed a memorial to her inside one of its churches. It was a modest tribute, a purely local one, nothing whatever on the scale of the vast palace her money had saved from ruin. But it was real, and it was given freely by the ordinary people who had actually known the living woman, and not the printed caricature of her. In Dorking, she was never the plain American with the notorious checkbook. She was simply the lady they had all been so fond of, and they marked her quiet passing exactly as such. And then, in the final arrangement of her burial, the oldest pattern of her whole life closed over her one last time. Lily Hammersley, born a Price of Troy in New York, was not buried among her own people in America, and she was not buried in the great house that her own fortune had rescued from collapse. She was laid to rest instead in the Beresford family crypt at Clonagam, in County Waterford, in Ireland, beside her third husband, in the ancestral burial ground of a family that was not, by her own blood, her own at all. Even her grave, in the end, belonged to a man's line rather than to hers. She had spent the whole of her life keeping her money in her own name, and in death she took her quiet place inside somebody else's vault. It was a fitting and a painful emblem of the single thing this entire story is about. The world remembered her when it troubled to remember her at all, only through the men who had stood beside her. Chapter 13. The organ plays for a name no one knows. More than a century later, her money is still holding up the house, and her name is still missing from the story of how it was saved. Blenheim Palace stands today as one of the most celebrated houses in all of Britain, a World Heritage Site, visited by great numbers of people every single year, who come to walk through its staterooms and its gardens and to marvel at the sheer grandeur of the place. And a very great deal of what those visitors walk through they owe, without ever once knowing it, to a woman whose name appears on almost none of the guidebooks they carry in their hands. The proof of her is still there, standing in the largest room in the entire house. In the long library, the great Willis organ that she paid for still stands and still plays, filling that enormous space with sound exactly as it was built and intended to do. Its inscription is still perfectly legible to anyone who troubles to go and read it, that tender promise of a voice to speak within these walls in years to come when ours are still. The makers of it are all still now, exactly as the carved words foretold that they would be. And yet the voice goes on speaking more than 100 years later, in a house full of moving visitors, almost none of whom could ever tell you that the woman who first gave it that voice was an American widow named Lily Hammersley, who mended the roof over their heads before Consuelo Vanderbilt was so much as spoken of at Blenheim. That is the true shape of her legacy, and it is a strange and a genuinely painful one. What survives is the work itself. The house stands, the roof holds, the organ sounds. What has not survived is any real memory of the worker. The popular story of how an American fortune came to save Blenheim belongs, in very nearly every telling of it, to Consuelo Vanderbilt, the beautiful young bride of the 9th Duke, and to a lesser degree, to Gladys Deacon, the doomed beauty who came after her into the same house. Both of those women are still vividly remembered, the one for her unhappy grandeur and the other for her tragic ruin. Lily, who came first and who paid first, is the one American of Blenheim whom history simply mislaid along the way. Look hard at the plain arithmetic of that forgetting, and the sheer unfairness of it stands out sharply against the stone. Lily's fortune reached Blenheim in the years around 1890. Consuelo's celebrated dowry did not arrive until 1895, a full 7 years later than Lily's money. Lily mended the roof, installed the heating, lit the halls, and gave the long library its cathedral organ, all of it before the Vanderbilt money ever touched a single stone of the estate. She was first by the better part of a decade, and yet she is remembered, on the rare occasions she is remembered at all, only as a footnote to the women who came after her. A plain, older widow, briefly glimpsed in passing before the famous bride sweeps in. She did the earlier work, and she got the later oblivion for her trouble. It is a peculiar kind of immortality, to be present everywhere in a place and named nowhere within it. Every visitor who stays dry beneath that great roof owes a small unknowing debt to Lily Hammersley. Every visitor who hears the organ fill the long library is listening, without knowing it, to her money speak. And every guidebook that tells the story of how American heiresses saved Blenheim usually names only the younger of them, and leaves the elder standing in the shadows where the credit never quite reaches. She is not absent from the house at all. She is woven right through the whole of it, in the roof, and the warmth, and the light, and the sound. She is absent only from the words that are used to tell its story, which is the one single place a person truly goes on living after death. There are small signs, now, at last, of a slow correction beginning, as the whole story of the dollar princesses has drawn fresh interest and fresh study. The great wave of American heiresses who traded their fortunes for old English titles between the 1870s and the First World War, Lily has begun to be recovered as one of the very earliest and boldest of them all, the woman who reached the very topmost rank of the English aristocracy a full generation before the pattern ever became familiar. A complete biography of her life appeared at long last in 2012, subtitled, tellingly, A Portrait with Husbands, its very title quietly admitting that almost everything the record has preserved of her survives only through the 3 men she married. The recovery has begun, but she remains far less known even now than the women who came after her, which is exactly the imbalance that so badly needs the naming. The organ still plays on, the name is still missing from the room, and the whole gap between those two simple facts is the entire reason her story deserves to be told again, and told loudly. Chapter 14. The Woman Who Paid to be Forgotten. Her story asks a hard question about power, the particular kind of power that fixes a roof rather than turning a head. For all the drama of her 3 marriages, the truth of Lily Hammersley is finally very simple and very unsettling to sit with. She held real power. She held it in the exact form that the world claims to respect the most, money in her own name, spent with judgment and nerve on lasting things. And the reward for holding power in that particular form, for spending rather than dazzling, for paying rather than charming, was to be quietly and thoroughly forgotten. History, it turns out, does not remember the woman who fixes the roof. It remembers the woman who breaks the hearts. Her power was never once in doubt while she actually wielded it. She commanded a fortune of around $7 million and an income near $150,000 a year, held entirely in her own hands, in an age when the law fully expected a wife to own nothing at all. She used that money to rescue a national monument that generations of dukes had failed to save. She fought a family through the courts of New York for the better part of a decade, and she kept her whole inheritance. She sued a reigning Duke of England for the return of her own money, and she made him settle. She married 3 separate times, and she wrote the financial terms of every single marriage herself, funding a duke and a war hero alike, while keeping the purse always in her own tight grip. Measure her by what she actually did, rather than by how she happened to look, and she stands among the most quietly formidable women of her entire era. And yet the very things that made her power so real are the very things that made it so easy to forget. She did not seduce a king, or destroy a statesman, or set a nation whispering. She did not leave behind a juicy scandal for the historians to feast upon for a century. She left instead a sound roof and a warm house and a bright-lit hall and a great singing organ, useful, expensive, undramatic gifts, exactly the kind of contribution that memory lets slip quietly through its fingers. She was competent in an age that wanted its remembered women tragic. She was generous where it wanted them beautiful, and she was businesslike where it wanted them romantic. She had, in the end, precisely the wrong kind of power ever to be remembered by it, the kind of power that keeps the cold rain out instead of the kind that sets the whole town talking. So think, for one moment, of every woman who has ever held that quieter, harder, less rewarded power. Think of the woman who signs the contract in her own name and asks no man's leave to do it. Think of the woman who keeps her own money and decides for herself, alone, exactly where it goes. Think of the woman who pays for the thing that lasts and then lets someone prettier step forward to take the bow for it. Think of the woman who does the essential, unglamorous, load-bearing work and then watches the credit for it drift steadily toward a more convenient and more decorative face. Lily Hammersley is the patron saint of every one of them, all the women who built and mended and paid, and were quietly left out of the very stories they had made possible. She was far more powerful than history ever let her be, and her power was exactly the kind that history is worst at keeping hold of. So return, at the very last, to the long library at Blenheim, where this whole story began. The organ is still there. It still fills that enormous room with sound, more than 100 years after an American widow reached into her own fortune and paid to build it. And the words are still carved deep upon it, still promising a voice to speak within these walls in years to come, when ours are still. She meant that promise for the music. But the music kept its voice down all the long years, while she herself lost hers entirely, and so the inscription became, without a single soul ever intending it, the truest thing that was ever written about her. Her gift still speaks in that room. Her name went silent. The voice that she built with her own money outlived, by a full century, the very woman the world refused to hear. The Times said that she had won for herself a secure place in the affections of the British people, and for one brief season that was even true. But affection is not the same thing as memory, and the palace she saved soon learned to tell its own grand story without her in it at all. So what, in the end, did her particular kind of power actually make possible? It helped keep one of the great houses of all England standing upright for the whole long century of visitors who came after her. It proved, for anyone willing to look, that a woman with cash and nerve could rescue a duke, restore a palace, and then take the next duke straight to court to be paid back what she was owed. And it pushed open, just a little wider, the same door that every dollar princess and every self-made heiress who came after her would walk through in turn, each one keeping her own money and buying her own place in a world not built to give it. She held that heavy door open for the women who came next, even as they let it swing quietly shut on her own name. And the question her silent, sounding organ leaves hanging in the air is the very one this channel always ends upon. How many women right now, in this age, are paying for the roofs that other people will one day be remembered for standing safely under? If a woman who paid to save one of England's greatest houses could be forgotten inside its own walls, how many others have been written clean out of the stories they made possible? Tell us in the comments whose money you truly believe saved Blenheim. The widow who came first, or the bride the whole world remembers, and why you think we let her name go so quiet. And if you believe that stories like hers deserve to be spoken aloud again, subscribe to Feminine Legacies and help these women be heard at last.